Grace and peace to you from the one who was and is to come. Amen. At last week's Sundays at Belmont event, I witnessed the moving sharing of experiences of loss and grief. I once again realized how prevalent and central loss and grief are not only in people's personal life, but also in society and the world at large. Israel's wisdom tradition is not afraid to engage this aspect of our life with honesty and passion. Among its wisdom writings, it is the author of the book of Ecclesiastes who stands out with his probing reflection and refreshing skepticism as he preoccupies himself with loss and suggests that life is a chasing after wind. According to the scholar J.T. Walsh, Ecclesiastes confronts us with a spirituality that accepts the darkness, surrenders to the mystery, and finally surrenders the dearest and deepest desire of the human heart to make sense of life. What we find in Ecclesiastes is a constant tearing down, highlighting the collapse of meaning. This is then again followed by a building up, the attempt to recover meaning. The sage and author is not afraid to reveal the contradictions that pervade life. These contradictions are recognized and not eliminated. He resists trying to harmonize them and is bold enough to face up to the paradoxical and at times even absurd aspects of human existence. To him, all we have are moments in time within which we are called to carve out small pockets of meaning. The dilemma is that we are always timed and struggle to be in control over our time. This renders us powerless and extremely vulnerable. What we do seem to have is power over our timing, the ability and courage to discern what time it is and to be present to it. This comes out most clearly in the poetry of chapter 3. There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Ecclesiastes encourages us to ask us what time it is for us right now. What is the season of life we find ourselves in at the moment? Only we ourselves will be able to answer this question. But will we muster the wisdom and courage needed to be present to it? What becomes clear is that with every change of season comes some experience of loss. And the challenge is to recognize and name the loss, to give ourselves the time to mourn it. It requires nothing less than keeping one's heart open. First circle. There's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot. In her book, Winter of the Heart, the writer and retreat leader Paula Darcy invites us to look with compassion at the season of grief, hoping to take us to a place where we find the courage to name and give voice to our sorrow. We all know how fragile life is. But according to Darcy, it is only at the moment when loss rips away our protective shell that we once again realize how delicate the balance really is between life and death. Grief brings us to this heartbreaking clarity. Now we see what we've always dimly known. We are vulnerable, and to love someone includes not only the willingness to know and be changed by that love, but also the possibility of losing him or her. Grief is what we do with that suffering. Cynthia Bourgeault describes the experience of mourning as being in a state of free fall, our heart reaching out toward what we have seemingly lost, but cannot help loving anyway. And there's really nothing in our life that can prepare us for this moment. To find ourselves on this journey through grief is demanding. Prior assumptions about life are suddenly challenged. Our former illusion of being in control is exposed, and it is difficult to admit that the world as we have known it may be thoroughly changed by loss. Darcy speaks of being suspended between pain and the great mystery of life. But what we need to bear in mind is that the circumstances of loss vary greatly, and that each heart breaks in its own way. She offers us a powerful metaphor when she suggests that grief is like a crucible that holds the human heart. When elements are placed in a crucible, they either melt or harden, they expand or they contract. We wonder if it's possible to keep our heart open as the pain moves through. Keeping open one's heart, or opening it once again, becomes the primary challenge of grief, for pain must move if it's to be transformed. We're tempted to deny the pain or hide it away inside, but our choices will affect our future and the ability to find healing. But once the river of sorrow is able to flow, the hope is that we will find the strength we didn't know we had. Such strength might come from hearing an invitation from deep within, calling out to us, or sensing a light coming in, no matter how faint. To hear such an invitation will take time, and it does not provide us with immediate answers. It rather raises new and fundamental questions about the way we relate to life, inviting us to discern the difference between what we think life should be and what life really is. It is in this way that grief creates an opening and poses some difficult questions. Where are my anchors? Are they within me, or have I placed them outside of myself? Does this loss have a lasting power? Do I still have choices? While we find our way through the dark, these questions are like seeds planted for the later harvest. The stories of those who have traveled through grief witness to the mystery of something both deeper and greater than loss. And it holds the promise that pain is not an end, but a doorway. Second circle. There is a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away. After the initial sense of shock, we attempt to find our bearings. While life continues, nothing seems the same. Both our outer and inner world seem unfamiliar. To feel loss is to feel lost and powerless. We cannot undo what has been done or said, and the search for something trustworthy and stable begins. Following the loss of her son, Darcy's friend Judy Myers describes her experience of loss as a form of sinking and drowning, as having slipped beneath the waters of the well of grief. She expresses her need to connect to something that she can count on and that will not fail her. Please bring me a bowl of warm, salty water. I want to put my face in it. I want to hold my breath and lay my face in water. I want to know it is holding me, and that even if my face sinks down to touch the bottom, the water's buoyancy will lift me again to the surface, and I will raise my head and breath. She needs to know that there's something that has not changed because of the loss. She longs to know that the water is still buoyant while drifting through a life that no longer makes sense. Egon Schie's painting titled Agony raises similar existential questions about life, love, suffering, and death. It is an allegory on human existence and its fragility. Schie's twisted figures are lonely and isolated. They have difficulty being present to each other, struggling to make eye contact. Their emaciated hands are desperately holding on to themselves or unsure how to find each other in an embrace. Schiele does not try to portray humans in their glory, but in their misery. They are wrapped up in robes and blankets to shield them from the cold. Is it just my imagination that even detects a dog's head at the bottom, sharing the agony of this moment? How not to be alone? How to be present to each other when words fail? Do the warm, dark colors of the painting speak of a greater love and mystery that longs to enfold us in our loss and pain? Third circle. There's a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Paula Darcy attempts to capture the distinct feelings and thoughts evoked by an experience of profound loss. You no longer understand life. You find yourself questioning whether you will love again. You wonder, why would anyone feel compelled to make that investment, to take that risk if love leaves you feeling this vulnerable? You can't decide if life is for you or against you. You wonder why God has not protected you. We are brought up to believe that anything can be fixed if we commit ourselves to it. But Darcy reminds us that grief is not something that can be fixed. Grief is something that must be lived. And it must be lived even though we cannot imagine, to speak with the writer John Curwen, that there is a nourishing love just below the surface of every good thing in life and every bad. Even though we might not be able to see it or believe it, the challenge is to keep listening to the endless questions surfacing and what life is saying to us through them. The problem is that our mind is not yet attuned to the subtle language of the deeper heart. Darcy's advice is to keep the days as simple as possible and to take time to feel and sit still. It is along those lines that the psychologist Susan Jeffers suggests, let go your picture of how you want it all to be. Let go trying to control things over which you have no control. When you give up needing it all to be a certain way, you can breathe a sigh of relief and open the next door. Thus he is adamant that there is no right way to grieve, and that there is no set time to open the next door. It is important to remember that we grieve in a way that is consistent with who we are, and we must each find our own way. There are no set rules or timetables for resuming a social life, visiting the grave, packing up clothes or toys, or changing a room. We can let go of things in stages. We don't have to do it all at once or in an orderly fashion. Fourth circle. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. We are heartened to cry when we need to cry, to stay emotionally honest, and to take our time. We might find that the reassurances of others offer little comfort. No two people grieve the same, and such difference needs to be respected. Loss is therefore also about accepting and honoring our own unique experience of grief. Every way of grieving is valid. Some of us cry easily and are comforted by the tears. Some grieve by talking about their feelings. Others prefer action, doing something, as a way to cope with feelings. Others find it difficult to cry or put feelings into words. Some deny what is happening to them for a long time. They cannot take it in. We will experience that a profound loss can alienate us from some and draw us closer to others. There will be those who cannot deal with our pain because they themselves cannot tolerate being suspended between life and death. They approach us not to comfort, but to be comforted. But there will always be those who know from their own experience what we are going through. They will not be afraid of our emotions and sense of being lost. Just think of how Jesus himself experienced such isolation and alienation. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the inner circle of disciples struggled to be present to him. Instead of taking seriously his plea to pray for him, they fell asleep. He was utterly alone in his grief. And even the God he used to address lovingly as Abba, dear Father, seemed distant and indifferent. The Gospel writer Luke tries to describe the intense agony by telling us that Jesus' sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Fifth circle. There's a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. For many, the real storm is said to move in about 3 to 6 months later. There will be those who do not understand the intensity and power of our pain and might even be afraid of it. We might have to resist those who want us to return to normal and have to set the kind of boundaries that give us the space and time we need. Thus he is adamant to say no to an invitation or an outing must be allowed without having to give elaborate explanations. She encourages us to say no as a complete sentence and to accept and honor someone's pace and manner of grieving is perhaps the greatest love we can express, and it's vital to include ourselves with this acceptance. Having to please people will be too costly for us. It steals the energy we need for our own healing. There's no right way to grieve, and grief is not orderly or tidy. We hoped there would be stages to our grief, and that with each stage we feel a little bit better. Shock, anger, sadness, and acceptance are aspects of our grief, but do not follow a set sequence. Grief has an unpredictable rhythm. After 2 steps forward, we might take 1 step back. What might look like a form of regression to us is but grief's way. Grief moves back and forth as we attempt to integrate the loss. Progress cannot be assessed in the usual way. We should not expect that with every day it gets a little better. 6th circle. There is a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak. And yet progress is made, even without us noticing it. What matters is that the pain is allowed to move from the inside of us to the outside. Grief needs to find expression through, for example, talking, crying, journaling, actively creating a memorial, purposefully expanding emotion by exerting ourselves with physical activity. It does not matter if we keep telling the story of our loss over and over again. It is not about informing others, but rather a way of trying to understand ourselves better and to keep searching for the place within us that is greater than the pain. Darcy shares her own journey of grief with her readers in how, one day, without explanation, the darkness lifts for a little while. This is the nature of grief. It moves back and forth. But day by day, even on the bad days, we're slowly integrating the loss. God bless you. God bless your journey of grief, lifting the darkness for a little while. God enfold you with robes and blankets that shield you from the cold. God bless you with friends who do not fall asleep, but know how important their prayer is for you. Amen.
Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For